The title of Chapter 4 is Responding to Conflict, a Practical Guide to Managing Your Own Conflicts. As indicated, the collaboration style of conflict management provides the most effective means of navigating conflicts and the outcomes. In other words, when parties work together, they're collaborating. Everyone contributes to managing the conflict, and this style provides really a win-win form of resolutions. But when conflicts occur, how do you respond? And how do you communicate in those situations? The text provides a system for resolving interpersonal conflicts through basic communication skills. The authors call this the STLC system: stop, think, listen, and communicate. So let's take a look at these. The first one is S, stopping, taking time out. In other words, when you realize that a conflict situation is going on, can you begin by saying to yourself, stop, let me take a minute before I engage or decide how I will respond to this situation. For some of us, this may be easy, and for others, it may be very difficult. And certainly, it depends on the time, the place, and the people involved. But so many times we don't stop. We immediately engage in the conflict situation, which oftentimes can even make things worse. It would be best to step away, take a moment to collect your thoughts, and evaluate the situation before you respond, and ideally even think about the perspective of the other person. This may take a few minutes, it may take a few hours or days perhaps even, but sometimes when you remove yourself from the situation before responding, the outcome will be much better. The next step is T for thinking about the conflict. This means think before you act. Thinking about the conflict means that you consider the cause and possible outcomes before you take actions. You examine the situation objectively, which means removing the emotions from the situation. And this can be very difficult oftentimes. But if you take time to collect your thoughts and you really think about your response ahead of time before you dive into battle, you're more likely to resolve the conflict successfully. Your authors actually provide two ways to think. Their first recommendation is to think about the actions, the choices that you have, and they provide 4 options to consider. One is that you may decide to do nothing and to live with the consequences, and honestly that's not really advisable, because if you've ever had that type of situation, sometimes that decision sort of eats away at the relationship. Also, another option will be to think about trying to change the other person. Again, very, very difficult. But you may be able to perhaps persuade the other person that what you're advocating or your position in the conflict is really in the best interest. A good example of this type of conflict may be with a teenager. If you've had a teenage child, sometimes parents just have to make decisions in conflict situations that are in the best interest of their child. The third type of action that you may engage in is to perhaps change yourself. Look at the issue and ask yourself, could or should I change my position on this issue, my wants or needs? I'll share with you a very personal story. Many years ago, I had a serious medical issue, and my teenage daughter and I fought constantly about her cleaning her room. Now, she kept the room clean to her standards, but there were things that I wanted her to do. I wanted her to demonstrate a higher level of cleanliness, if you will. It seems like I was constantly frustrated with her not doing the actions, cleaning her room, completing the activities, chores that I wanted her to do, which were really outside the normal expectations. And I was just so upset because she knew I didn't feel well, and I was resentful that she wasn't doing that. And then one day she said to me, "Mom, I know how sick you are, and but really is battling over these expectations that you have, which are not the normal expectations. Is it worth it? Is that what we really should be struggling with, and that just sort of woke me up to reshape my priorities. Although I still expected her to keep her room clean, I didn't expect her any longer to keep it to this showcase level, if you will, that was really very unrealistic of a teenager's room, to be truthful. The fourth action that your author suggests is that maybe you change the situation. And this is really a drastic step most oftentimes. Maybe you need to get out of a relationship. Maybe you need a new roommate. Maybe you need to change jobs. Generally, when you're thinking about taking this type of action, that means that the other options haven't worked, and so therefore more drastic steps need to be taken. Then the second thing that the authors present that you probably should think about are the goals involved in the conflict situation. And something I really want you to remember is that a key factor to thinking about or before you address a conflict situation is to always consider your goals as well as the other person's goals. And the authors present 4 types of goals that are relevant in conflict situations. The first type of goal that may be present in a conflict is what the authors call instrumental goals, and this is where you're requiring one party to remove a specific obstacle blocking the completion of a task. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier about tangible and intangible things. So instrumental goals would be tangible in that an example may be that your roommate just refuses to take out the trash, and so that's causing a conflict in your situation. That's an example of an instrumental goal. Also, there may be relational goals evident in a conflict situation, and in relational goals, you're really trying to understand the roles each person plays in the relationship. And oftentimes this involves attempts to gain power or trust with the other individual. And back to the roommate example, each person needs to recognize that they're a contributing member to that relationship. One person shouldn't have to be the parent to tell the other what the expectations are in terms of keeping the apartment clean. The third type of goal involved in a conflict is what your authors call identity goals, and this involves how the parties involved view each other. Each party's identity is very important to that individual. The respect involved, their self-image, self-esteem. Unfortunately, we often, in conflict situations, attack or insult the image of the other, which exacerbates the conflict situation. And again, looking at the roommate conflict, there were qualities that attracted you to one another that made you want to share a living space together, but perhaps now in a conflict situation there are issues or characteristics about the other that are causing the catalyst for the conflict. Maybe the person's become lazy or selfish or disengaged from the relationship. And then the final type of goal that may be present is a process goal. And these are alternative ways to manage conflict situations, really to navigate how you will interact with the other party. For example, one person in the relationship may want openness and the other party may be very private. And certainly this can change over time as relationships mature. One person in the party may want brutal honesty. In contrast, the other may want honesty tempered with sensitivity. A personal example of this would be that I want my husband to be honest with me, but if there's a situation, for example, where I ask him how something looks, I want him to be honest but also kind. The authors state that ideally parties will agree on process goals before engaging in conflict over an issue. And this could be that you agree that, when you have a conflict, you won't get personal, you won't verbally attack the other person, you won't raise your voices. And I think this is a good objective, but I also think that this could be an unrealistic expectation at times. Now that we've talked a lot about thinking, the third component of the STLC basic communication skills model in conflict situations is listening. Listen before you respond, and oh my goodness, this can be so difficult because when you're in the middle of a conflict situation, our natural response is to mentally start defending ourselves, building our argument why we're right or the other person is wrong. Listening requires us to focus our attention on the other person, not just hear them, because hearing and listening are not the same, but pay attention, be disciplined, be empathetic, want to understand what the other person is saying and how they're feeling. This doesn't mean that you have to agree with what they're saying. Instead, it is acknowledging that you value what the other person is saying before you respond to the conflict situation. And the final component in this model, this basic skills of engaging in conflict, is communicating. And there are many different ways in which we respond in conflict situations. And remember that when we communicate, we do that through two channels: verbal, the words that we use, as well as nonverbal, our body actions, our facial expressions, those non-words that are sending messages as well. Effective communication is critical if you are going to manage a conflict situation through collaboration. Both parties must be engaged, both parties must be communicating. And the authors recommend that we use assertive communication, which is the ability to speak for one's own interest, concerns, or rights in a way that does not interfere with the interest or infringe on the rights of others. In summary, it is standing up for yourself. And this can be difficult too. Conflict situations are hard enough to begin with, but oftentimes being assertive, standing up for yourself, can be so challenging. But it's critical that you do that. My mother always said that no one will ever be a better advocate for yourself than you will, and that is the truth. Assertive communication means that you are expressing your feelings, your position, your beliefs. Being assertive is representing you, yourself. In contrast, don't get this confused with being aggressive, which is not being respectful of the other party. It's infringing on their rights. It's being overly forceful, perhaps even threatening. Bullying would be an example of aggression. Along with you being assertive and communicating your position, this also comes with the responsibility of respecting the rights of others. Now that we've examined communication skills that can be used in managing conflict situations and hopefully reaching resolution, we need to look at what happens if you can't. What happens if you need to confront the other party? Oftentimes, if we can't resolve a conflict and we have to confront the other party, we just dive into it. We go full speed ahead and don't really give thought to a process. But the authors provide a 6-step confrontation process for help managing that type of situation. Let's look at these 6 steps briefly because your book provides a lot of great information you'll want to take a look at. The first and most important step is preparation, identifying the problem, the issue, the needs. In other words, what do we need to address? You've taken the time to analyze the situation. You've looked at who, what, where, when, how, why, what something went wrong. This is not just about how you feel about the conflict. Second step, schedule a convenient time and place to talk, and I want to emphasize the word talk here. Think about professionalism here. I want to emphasize, and I can't overly emphasize, that you want to schedule a time to talk. It is not appropriate to send an email or to send a text in conflict situations when you're having to confront a problem like this. Also think about, do you need to meet at a neutral location? Certainly a private location. Do you need to go to that individual's workspace, or do they need to come to yours? And really, the conflict issue dictates that. In other words, is this an issue that the other party needs to be called to the boss's office to talk about? Then step 3, this is where you have the conversation, talk to the other party. Again, this is where assertive communication is so important. Good eye contact, use open gestures, use a strong voice. Step 4, consider the other person's point of view, and that's always important in resolving conflict. Demonstrate empathy, in other words, considering the issue from the other person's vantage point. The 5th step, you are seeking to resolve the problem and reach a mutually satisfying agreement. And if the issue is important enough, your book recommends maybe putting that in writing or maybe sending a follow-up email to just document the conversation that you just had. And then finally, the authors recommend step 6 to have a follow-up conversation regarding the solution. I really think that whether or not you do this step is determined by the issue at hand as to whether or not there needs to be a follow-up conversation about, is the solution working, has the behavior changed, have things improved? And there may need to be another conversation about considering a different course of action. Finally, the authors recommend that you follow this 6-step process in sequence, in order, and I do think it provides a very helpful framework for addressing a conflict situation when you have to confront an issue. The final topic that this chapter covers that I want to draw your attention to is using I statements in your communication when you're in conflict situations. I statements enable the one party to personalize or express how that conflict is affecting that individual as opposed to attacking the other person or making the other person defensive. I statements are less threatening and reflect ownership of the feelings as opposed to expressing blame or criticism. And there are 4 components: the feelings statement, the behavior statement, the consequences statement, and the goal statement, how this conflict can be resolved from that individual's perspective. To walk through this, let's use the conflict situation with our roommate who continues to leave wet towels on the bathroom floor. So, first up, I feel frustrated when I have to pick up the wet towels on the bathroom floor because that forces me to have to take time to wash another load of laundry because the towels weren't in the dirty clothes hamper. And I'd like for you to make sure that all your wet towels are in the hamper when you have taken a shower. So as you can see, this is a much more honest and less threatening way to approach this situation. You're owning your feelings and the impact that this is having upon you as opposed to attacking the other person or placing blame or making them be defensive. But please note how eye contacts are delivered, facial expressions, the tone of your voice impacts whether or not they will be received effectively. In other words, they should be delivered in a calm, non-threatening manner and certainly without sarcasm. It's a very effective way to communicate your feelings in conflict situations, but let's be honest, it will be a skill that may need to be cultivated. In closing, this chapter concludes by offering ideas for being creative in ways to think about managing conflict situations. All the chapters we've covered so far talk about communication and how important the words and our actions and our choices are in managing conflict situations. I hope this has been helpful. Take care and God bless.